In the last video, I discussed our discovery of two Knights Templar bells, all within a significant catalogue of professional misplay and incompetence. Two bells hanging in a discarded church that was sold to us with a conservation plan to turn this church into a 3-bedroom home for a family for an architect estimated cost of £150,000. But instead of a home to make, we found archaeological evidence and historical reports that dictated the church rehabilitation to be in the millions of pounds, a deceit fostered by ignorant and incompetent former owners and their agents. I briefly discussed a discovery which has to be one of the most significant finds not found in the ground this millennia. We had corrected a significant misunderstanding of the site and its bells formed in the Victorian period, adopted as fact by over 100 years of historians, both local and academic, and restored the original local understanding from the Georgian era, that the site was once, in the 12th century, in Knights Templar possession, and the bells, both 12th century, were remnants from that Templar possession. We had dedicated 18 months of focused scholarly research, the first ever carried out not only on the bells, but the origins of Templar kind in Scotland. Yet our discovery would become eclipsed by academic prejudice and bureaucratic tomfoolery, and an absence of wholesale merit in Scotland's heritage sector, as it deliberately ignores what is obvious, giving us the reason for these videos as we attempt to reach out to common sense and good people to come to our and the bell's aid. However, my protest is grossly misplaced and our appeals to the public empty rhetoric if I cannot convince you beyond any doubt my wife and I have two bells cast in the 12th century on the instruction of a master of the Scottish Knights Templar for a Scottish Templar presbytery here at Holywood in Dumfriesshire. Two bells that are, by proof and not speculation, are the only significant provenanced Templar material artefact not only in Scotland, but so far found in the world, and so are priceless and unique. But to have you believe our discovery and to challenge what others may tell you, we cannot be vague about who sponsored the bells. We need to be certain who the bell sponsor or sponsors were, what their rank and purpose was at the time the bells were cast, and any relationship they had with Holywood here in Dumfriesshire. The evidence must be as indisputable as ABC or 1, 2, 3. There must be no unproven connections or spurious third-hand circumstance, Templar crosses, fallacies, conjectures or legends leading the evidence. We need hard, immutable facts, and any compelling circumstantial evidence presented must support that fact, not replace it. We need our investigation and any subsequent report and its conclusion to be able to be understood by anyone, regardless of their comprehension of medieval history, with facts and evidence that speak for themselves and allow anyone to see the obvious. In 2020, my wife and I found ourselves having to validate one of two very different historical opinions of two medieval bells hanging in this Dumfriesshire church tower that had recently come into our possession, all so we could obtain insurance. We wanted to display the bells to the public so they would not be lost to the public, hidden from view, now they were silenced. And to do so, we needed insurance. And insurance requires a valuation. The traditional official opinion, the opinion that has informed the valuation of the church, its bells and conservation plan for the building when we bought it, were that both bells were of early 16th century manufacture, thus attracting a potential nominal insurance valuation for the two bells of around £40,000. The other recorded opinion, the one made in the 18th century but had been superseded by a later Victorian view, was that one of the bells was cast in the 12th century. The other bell, by its shape and crude manufacture, was cited by several bell historians as certainly a side cast bell, a pre-13th century design known amongst bell historians as high or long-waisted, an older form replaced by the 13th century by the more recognisable squatter bell shape we see today. Perversely, the bell's antiquity had been observed by every former inspector, including those that had attributed a 16th century date to what was clearly a far older bell. Our insurance assessors, comparing the actual inscriptions and bells to the reported record, poured doubt on the 16th century dating and agreed with closer public inspection, those in the know would certainly challenge what had been accepted as the traditional view, as for instance published in and presented in Wikipedia. If the bells were indeed of 12th century manufacture, valuation would be potentially around £100,000 per bell, within a sliding scale of value depending on any revised provenance. To resolve the conflicting views, we had a problem. We could not contract the problem out to experts, as bell historians could only confirm the bell shape, not the provenance, nor even give a confirmed date for the manufacture of the bells, particularly as one bell and its form had existed from the 12th century to the current day. There was no academic expertise specific to our problem, and it was doubtful any institution such as the National Museum Scotland or any Scottish university or even history group had the time or resources to resolve the matter in full. There was an issue of cost. We were already on a tight budget, so any extra cost given over to research to resolve the issue was not a priority, but it still had to be done. A detailed study and research carried out constrained by the COVID pandemic. The other issue was the older bell, confirmed as likely pre-1200, was very likely to be the original bell cast at the founding of Holywood Abbey. This made the bell unique and not simply a bell taken from a medieval church. The bell was extremely special and had to be recorded as such. Since Holywood Abbey was founded in the mid-part of the 12th century and the other bell had a date of 1154 attributed to it through the 18th century statistical account of Scotland, it meant this bell could also be from the founding of the abbey. Thus we had a pairing of bells that was unique in the world. The oldest pairing in the world, not only in the UK. This kind of history was not for overlooking, it needed to be resolved. However, we were fortunate in that my wife and I had a degree of expertise when it came to evaluating both the material aspects of medieval antiquities and any historical narrative. My wife and I were both professional analysts, with a good grasp of both military and medieval history. But in truth, even with a good basis of understanding, it took us nearly 3 years of study and learning to come to one inarguable conclusion, because we had to carry out research no one had carried out before and test and review that research. So with that out of the way, I'm going to split the next very important chapter into two parts, giving detail of some of the key evidence that supports our claim and discovery. The first part will look at the interpretation of the engraving on the two bells to determine, without any room for doubt, who was their sponsor. The bell's sponsor will help us determine the bell's age, or at least narrow the date range of their manufacture. In the second part, I will discuss the sponsor's legend on medieval charter and record and further determine his role in connection with the Hollywood site beyond being the bell's sponsor. This Hollywood church bell carries a note of A flat and is around 36 centimetres tall and has a single line of engraving within an inscription band of around 90 centimetres, running just below the shoulder of the bell. The text opens with a cross paté, a symbol of spiritual devotion, a form of cross commonly used in the medieval period. This type of cross is commonly referred to as a Templar cross or cross formé. It is a form of cross commonly used in early medieval art, appearing on church items and objects associated with a Christian faith. And although this form of cross is heavily associated with the Crusades and the Knights Templar, our study ignored this form in this context, as this style of cross was used universally across a large number of different Christian institutions and holy orders. The inscription is made up of tiles. These tiles in the bell casting process were made by pouring wax into a carved wooden mould, and the resultant wax tiles then applied to a false bell or cope. This then creates the inscription in relief on the outer bell-shaped mould, forming the outer profile of the bell. Spaces between the tiles indicate missing punctuation or disconnects between individual words and phrases. Following the cross is what previous observers saw as the bell sponsor's name. The original minister of the new Hollywood church in the 18th century read the name as Johannes Rich, assuming the letter I, was the initial of the sponsor's Christian name. In a much later inspection carried out by a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland in 1898, he discounted the previous interpretation and read the name as Johannes Welch. There was indeed a John Welch recorded as an abbot of Holywood between 1491 and 1517, spelt with a letter S, not a letter C, but spelling in the medieval period is very unreliable. I stress there is no complete record of the abbots of Holywood until the late 15th century, leaving 300 years with only 5 abbots mentioned in record, potentially serving the abbey. In a later video I will illustrate, however, how none of these early abbots can be assigned with certainty to Holywood here in Dumfriesshire, because there are 2 monastic houses known as Holywood and its Latin and Gaelic derivatives within 100 miles of each other, each roughly equidistant from Whitton Priory and the cathedral chapter of the Diocese of Galloway, an important centre of religious activity in the region. In an audit carried out in 1911 on the Holywood bells, the inspector from the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland read the name as I. Wyche, declaring Johannes to be only an assumption. In superficial consideration of the engraved name, all these interpretations can be read by someone with an untrained eye. But in consideration of the individual characteristics of the individual letters, none of the prior interpretations work with what is actually engraved on the bell. The letter following the letter I, the letter W, is corrupted. It has a deliberate tool cut into its serif, the serif leading to the next letter. The cut is not a casting flaw, nor a design of the letter W, but a deliberate corruption formed by the bellmaker to indicate the letter W is more than a letter W, but a contraction, That is, there are more letters to follow the letter W. There are letters missing. Considering this is a name presentation, it implies that the letter W is most likely the initial of the sponsor's name rather than the letter I, which is actually disconnected from the name by a space between the tiles. It is an observation well supported when we discuss the letter following the letter W and in time the engraving on the second bell. The initial letter W could represent any medieval Christian name beginning with W, but it will most likely be a popular name rather than an obscure name such as Wyman or Walkelin. W is much more likely to represent Walter, Warren, or William. William being by far the most popular name amongst men, at least by the 13th century, that is. The next letter is a Gothic-style minuscule letter E, which is unusual as the name presentation, as is the rest of the inscription, is presented in Lombardic capitals, a development from a 8th century unicale lettering system. As a letter form, Lombardic-style lettering is largely replaced on bell inscription after the 13th century by a letter form that approximates to black letter. However, Lombardic-type lettering is maintained on smaller objects such as seals and coins because Lombardic capitals are far easier to read than black letter, which was a letter form developed to save space on parchment, a costly item in the medieval period. Here is an illustration of later black letter form and decoration you routinely find on bells dating from the late 14th century onwards. In this case, on the 15th century bell of Holm Abbey, 20 miles from Holywood across the Solway Firth. In terms of decoration, it is significantly different to both the Holywood bells. As Lombardic lettering is used throughout the Holywood bell inscription, you would expect a Lombardic capital E to feature in the sponsor's name as displayed elsewhere in the inscription. And as Lombardic capital E's are used elsewhere in the inscription, there is no reason to expect the bell maker not to use the same form if he intended the letter to be purely a letter E. The unusual presence of a small Gothic letter E in the middle of a name presented in Lombardic capitals was noted in both the 1898 and 1911 inspections, but still read as an E without an explanation why it was included. But dropping a minuscule letter into a word made up of capital letters was as deviant in the Middle Ages as it is today, unless it is an abbreviation, a popular contraction of letters, recognizable by the bell maker, the sponsor, and those who could read the bell when it was made, but not necessarily recognized by the modern observer. However, as a Gothic letter E is employed, the inclusion of an E is still implied within the abbreviation. And whatever the contraction is represented by the Gothic E, it must make sense preceding ICH. The letter following the Gothic style E is a letter I and not a letter L, as reported in 1898, making up the name you will see reported in Wikipedia against Holywood Abbey and one of its bells. A Lombardic capital L always has a leg and beak. The letter I is used in the name engraved on the bell, appears 6 times on the bell inscription in identical form, each time unambiguously representing the letter I. We measured the letter I characters with a micrometer and found all the letters to be cast from the same mould, exposing the Victorian's 1898 description of the letter I in the sponsor's name being different to the other letter I's, justifying his interpretation of the letter as an L as false. A contrivance to meet his theory that the name on the bell was Welsh instead of Rich, as previously reported. The remaining letters C and H are both Lombardic capitals, and yes, what looks like a small letter H is indeed a Lombardic capital H. Whatever the missing letters are, one has to precede ICH and make sense. And one letter must be a letter E. The range of missing letters cannot be too complex or uncommon in the period the bell was made. The only three letters immediately preceding ICH that make sense are B for biche or R for rich or riche. I have denoted there may be a lack of an E completing the name, as the written name in the medieval period was inconsistent, dropping vowels that did not sound out when speaking. Old French pronunciation would be an alien sound to the modern ear, adapted as it was from Frankish Proto-Germanic. Riches developed from rich, meaning ruler, and like ancient Latin, early medieval languages were often spoken with harsher notes. The other possible letter is an E for eich, which features in Gaelic as a term used for horse and German as a term for oak tree. It was a considerable exercise to consider all the different possibilities, including computer modelling, while all the time growing in empathy and understanding with the bell maker's mind and his art as a fellow artisan, bronze founder and engraver. It was dissection of the Gothic letter E used on the bell and common name constructs and consideration of the initials on the second bell, together with an appreciation of the armorial, that led us to only one plausible conclusion. Within the construction of names in the medieval period, French names common to nobility included what is termed nobiliary particles. These are de, French for of, and le, French for the. It is a common naming convention, a one often abbreviated or omitted entirely in script and inscription. We considered that it may be a common nobiliary particle that was abbreviated, preceding and containing the first letter or first few letters of the bell sponsor's surname. Dissecting the Gothic letter E, three Gothic letters are presented: L, E, and R. We tested other letter combinations in a variety of medieval letter forms in order to expand the Gothic letter E, in an attempt to reason out what the few letters outside the letter E could be missing. Only LER produced a workable, logical abbreviation that worked with ICH, presenting the name as W. Lrich or W. Lurish. Presuming the W would represent a common use name, only William Lurish, Walter Lurish, or Walren Lurish appears to be the most probable. Therefore, the single letter I at the beginning of the inscription has nothing to do with the bell sponsor's name. But it must have purpose, and as an abbreviation, it must be clear and unequivocal. What you repeatedly find at the beginning of engraving on many medieval devotional Christian items and donation is a kind of invocation. With origins in the 5th century, a Christogram is often employed at the beginning of invocations and donations, representing the name of Jesus. Sometimes IX for Iesus Christos, or IHC or IHS, representing the first three letters of Jesus' name in Greek: iota, eta, and sigma. In later Latin incarnation, IHC or IHS become Iesus Hominum Salvator, or Jesus Saviour of Mankind. This convention was common on medieval church bells. It exists, for example, as IHC on the 1462 bell of Holm Cultram Abbey, 20 miles from Holywood. The letter I on the Holywood bell, commencing the inscription, is also a Christogram. Not necessarily a commonly recognised later medieval form, but a recognized Christogram nonetheless in its simplest form. Eosis, or Jesus, simply abbreviated to the letter I, the Greek letter iota, as found in early Christian manuscripts. The remaining inscription includes the sponsor's dignity over the monastic house, abbas, or father, and the name of the house, Sacra Nemor, or Holywood. A character supporting the word representing Nemor is a stylized representation of a copse or wood in which you can read a letter N and a letter M. The inclusion of an E at the end of the tile representing Nemor could have been omitted, but it may be a clever double use of Nemor as me, as in me ferit fecit, which follows Sacra Nemor and means had me made. But ferit fecit without the me preceding can also stand on its own with the same meaning. So this double use theory is only my conjecture. The last letter making up fecit is shaped like a cross and is used to sign off the first part of the inscription. The date 1505 proposed by the 1898 inspection, the date you'll read in the Wikipedia entry for Holywood Abbey, and employed as the accepted view by academia, National Museum Scotland, and the historical record maintained by Historic Environment Scotland, is grossly incorrect. The date 1505 is not present on the inscription. The Victorian hypothesis that translated the inscription to AD 1505 was invention, contrivance to support a name hypothesis of Welsh, a theory that is also without evidence on the bell to support it. The bracketed letters on the translation carried out in 1898, the translator claims were space-saving solutions created by the bell founder, and whereas some of the abbreviation proposed by the 1898 translation does exist, none of the translator's significant invention and assumption to make the number 1505 or 1505 has any contemporary example or logic to support it. And there is ample space on the inscription line to include a recognizable date without the need for gross and untidy contraction. The full analysis of the errant Victorian date hypothesis is presented in a report, available as a free download on our website. But the omission of the 1,000-year nominal millesimo, often abbreviated to M, claimed by the Victorian interpretation to save space, is far too important to miss out, which is why there is no case study, no example to support this paradigm of missing vital numbers from year dates. Instead of reading the only number that is presented, 20 or vigissimo, the Victorian added missing letters required for his dating hypothesis to make it work for his proposed bell sponsor. And even the last character is not a V for 5 as reported, but the number 2. The last character has 2 strokes, with the last stroke canted at an angle to sign off the number, a common practice in medieval number management to prevent the fraudulent addition of further Roman numerals to corrupt the intended number. Without a date being clearly presented, A and D does not represent Anno Domini in the year of our Lord, but simply the undisputable common contractions for the medieval Latin words annus as year and dominus as master. The only number clearly and unambiguously presented on the bell is vigissimo secundo, 22 or 22nd. The donut above the letter E represents the common abbreviation simo, indicating contraction of the ablative case of the number. In Latin, specific dates and years are expressed using ordinal numbers, first, second, third, but when expressing a year or a period of years an event occurs, the numeral is presented in the ablative case. Quum, abbreviated as Q in attachment preceding the number, conditions the ordinal number following. In this case, quum vigissimo secundo, or 20-fold and 2. The mark above the letter I, the Victorian assumed was an indication of abbreviation, which he employed to excuse the missing letter N, but fails to explain why there are no similar marks employed elsewhere on the bell to indicate other missing letters, is a bellmaker's mark, of which there are two more similar marks above the inscription, neither of which conditions the inscription below. So we have years, master, and 20-fold in 2 inscribed on the bell. It is simply a declaration of the bell sponsor's length of tenure as master over the convent, 20-fold and 2 years as master. It is not a date. A truancy of merit in the Victorian interpretation has been expressed by every inspection since 1898, with doubt expressed over its accuracy, including the Scottish Government audit in 1911 and in 1993 by celebrated bell historian and engineer Ranald Clouston, as well as a public campaign in 2009 and 2010 led by a local ecclesiastic and a local church bell conservation group. Yet the Church of Scotland, the local historical community and the official record inexcusably allowed the bell's false dating to stand as record and the true date to remain unresolved. Such was the lack of care or understanding of the Church of Scotland's own possession or its importance in terms of the region's and country's historical legacy. And so with this negligent behaviour, the bell was allowed to be lost into private hands, without any guarantee that the new keeper would treat the bells as nothing more than a quirky architectural feature to lock up and forget. Whereas it took us some time to learn about the nuances of Latin inscription and the rules of medieval Latin abbreviation to understand better what was inscribed on the bell, even to the layman, regardless of their understanding of medieval epigraphy, there were inescapable problems with the traditional view of the inscription that anyone with a basic grasp of Latin number form and logical observation could see. Perhaps in the greater scheme of local day-to-day existence in the 20th century, such conundrums are mere detail, and not terribly critical to the day-to-day function given over to the bells when the church was in use. But in terms of dating the bells and a crucial understanding of the origins of the bells and the bell sponsor, it was detail that should not have escaped prudent attention in the last 100 years, and is a sad reflection on local historians and 100 years of academic sponsorship of Scottish history, particularly as the exceptional antiquity and provenance of the bells was already publicly recorded before a Victorian was allowed, perhaps to bolster his own ego over his peers, rather than bolster the merited understanding of local history. Saying that, the Victorian antiquarian was not wrong to propose something so deviant to evidence a medieval practice. After all, the antiquarian, like us all, was limited to their own understanding and led by their own theories and opinions, rather than the actual evidence on the bell and any practiced, competent understanding. And so he was allowed to put forward his opinion, regardless if it was correct or incorrect. But what is important is that any theory or opinion presented should be allowed to be challenged in review by fact and evidence, not only in peer review by the proposer's contemporaries, but in post-inspection, audit and modern consideration by those academia puts forward as specialist, learned scholars, particularly in matters such as our example here, medieval script and engraving, on what is some of the most valuable Christian church bells in the world. As our story progresses in these videos, this critical concept of challenge is grossly absent from the study and understanding of material history, and as our case illustrates, is an inexcusable truancy intentionally promoted by academia. And as you will see in future videos, the obvious error in the translation in the Hollywood bell, accepted by over 100 years of academically accepted historians, is actually still defended by current scholars today, because challenge is not allowed. Not because the Victorian view is correct or is recognised as a competent understanding, but because it is what academia has accepted as correct, even though it is so obviously incorrect. Because academia has imposed such a prejudiced control over the understanding of history, fossilizing its own record is infallible and indisputable. It has corrupted any good sense and any possibility of true objective study, pouring doubt on the competence and even the value of academic historical study. But now back to the bells, and the second bell, the high-waisted bell. The second bell, the older design, is inscribed with initials and an armorial, a shield or escutcheon depicting a coat of arms of the sponsor rather than the bell maker. It was the initials and armorial confirmed by the College of Arms on this bell that signed off W. Lariche as presenters, not only on the newer inscribed bell, but both bells. The College of Arms confirmed the letters as a Lombardic capital V, representing either V, U, or the letter W, combined with, as the second initials, a Gothic letter L, conjoined with a Lombardic capital R. The 1898 inspection had read the combined L and R as a K. But as a K, there is no comparable letter form on record. Its ascender is too large for the letter to be a Lombardic K. The College of Arms confirmed the armorial on the bell first appeared on record attached to Austin of Walpole, Norfolk, with no connection to Holywood, Scotland, nor the church. Appearing in Papworth's Ordinary of British Armorials, it was a unique design, probably post-dating the 12th century, but that did not exclude its existence before 1200, as there is very little armorial record from that period. But the problem was, in regards to the bell, was the unworkable monogram of VLR, which did not connect it to Austin. But there was nothing precluding the armorial existing with another holder preceding Austin of Walpole. Forgive me for skipping a little ahead of myself, revealing the results of our investigation laid out in part 2. But as we will find out in part 2, on W. Lariche's death, or to be precise, William Lariche's death, around 1185, William Lariche's personal armorial was not passed on to a family member. Nor does it form the basis of the coat of arms of the Scottish line of the De Maulle clan, William Lariche's descendant family. William Lariche not having any male issue, it was entirely possible his armorial was passed to another, not necessarily family, but an unrelated individual by legal agreement. It was a practice often employed in medieval feudal society. Although there is no apparent connection between Austin of Walpole, Norfolk and Holywood, nor the Scottish Church, William Lariche does have a connection to Norfolk and Walpole, as evidenced by his presence as a witness on a Norfolk charter dated sometime between 1160 and 1200 concerning a grant of land between William, son of Sir Thomas de Warburton, and St Mary's Priory, Binham, Norfolk, a Benedictine monastery relatively close to Walpole. It is the only charter found where William Lariche exists outside Northumberland and Scotland on any record. And as he appears as a witness in a region where he has no landholding responsibility, it implies his presence may be personally motivated rather than administrative. Of course, any direct personal connection between William Lariche and Austin of Walpole is speculative, but a connection does potentially exist. However, the compelling evidence, the evidence that presents the armorial on the bell as belonging to a Lariche, or more precisely William Lariche, as represented by the initials VLR, is the resurrection of the design on the bell, with only slight variation with replication down to the colour of the field and ordinaries as exhibited on the Austin armorial, with only a variation to the cross charges. It was created by the College of Arms in 1533 for Richard Rich, who was to become Lord Chancellor of England. It is unlikely the College of Arms in 1533 would have invented an unconnected armorial, plucked it out of thin air. Following the college's genealogical research of the potential lineage of Richard Rich, they would have linked it to the Lariche ancestry in England, Scotland, or France. The design bears too much likeness to the colour of the field, ordinaries, and charges not to be directly referenced not to the Austin of Walpole, but to the armorial on the bell and William Lariche. Austin of Walpole's armorial was already recorded at the time, hence probably the necessary variation. The traditional view of this bell is that it was cast in the 16th century. Based on the 1898 inspection and identification of the armorial belonging to William Kennedy, commendator of Holywood Abbey between 1524 and 1540, with the initials on the bell being VK. The proposed dating was despite the inspector acknowledging the bell was ancient in appearance. However, the armorial the 1898 inspector quotes is not represented on the bell, and the armorial described by the Victorian inspector is not Kennedy arms, as the charges on the Kennedy arms are crosses crosslet fichi and not crosses fichi as described by the inspector. The inspector lends his observation weight by misreading a casting floor on one cross, when the bell founder's intent is clearly demonstrated on the remaining crosses. And the initials on the bell are not VK. Compounding the error, the 1911 government audit citing the correct Kennedy arms confirmed the escutcheon on the bell as Kennedy's, when clearly it is not. And as we'll find out in a later video, this misrepresentation is further compounded by a heraldry expert from National Museum Scotland, confirming the arms likely to be Kennedy's, attributing the differences between Kennedy's arms and what is actually on the bell as approximation, and as such is good enough. But since legal precision in heraldry had existed from the 13th century, such argument is entirely unfounded. The 1898 inspector was a regarded local antiquarian, fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, appearing to be respected amongst his peers, as was the 1911 government auditor and National Museum Scotland's heraldry expert. We explore in other videos if the obvious misrepresentation was wholesale incompetence or duplicity between fellows of the Society of Antiquaries, mirroring a universal academic philosophy of not challenging fellow antiquarians and scholars' work. The 1898 inspector was a Freemason, so we investigated the quality of the inspector's observations in other cases to determine if his misrepresentation of the bells was not down to incompetence, but perhaps subterfuge to hide the truth of the bell's Knights Templar origins. This was a thought generated by a conundrum: an apparent abandonment of the local understanding of the Holywood site existing in 1843, but failed to be maintained locally a mere 50 years later, particularly amongst a local history-focused society. This potential shrouding of Templar history was supported by the perverseness of the entire former Abbey of Holywood being swept away completely, stone and record, even the foundations being robbed away as late as the 20th century. Odd in a region with the skeletons of abbeys still standing everywhere. A great deal of artefact and stone was removed from the site and passed over to local landowners and the local community to subsequently become lost. To date, we have only managed to recover one stone potentially removed from the site, a marker stone, exhibiting a cross. Although a design known to be employed by the Knights Templar, we have no firm indication of its original location in context with the former church. Be sure to stay tuned into our story and subscribe to our channel as we explore Masonic connection, secret Catholic Templar societies, criminality, corruption, and deliberate collusion with incompetence. The problem we faced with interpreting the bell inscription, considering it should have been a relatively straightforward exercise, was for all we approached over 24 medieval Latin paleographers for help, their contribution was inconclusive. Invariably, the translation presented back to us was the 1898 translation, and it was repeated back to us verbatim time and time again. But when we raised the problems with the transcription, the obvious mistranslation of letters, the ignorance of elements that were clearly represented on the bell, and the patently errant dating paradigm used by the 1898 translation, with key characters missing, that resulted in a nonsensical translation, most paleographers glossed over the key elements they could not interpret, and any anomalies they ignored. Most surprisingly, most did not appreciate the difference between epigraphy and paleography. Some rules are certainly shared, but appearance is the primary concern of the engraver, not time or paper conservation, the guiding principle of the scribe. Any omissions or contrivances required to make sense of the 1898 inscription were all attributed to, by most of the paleographers we consulted, to saving space on the bell or the bell maker's error. It was revealing when we presented the inscription without context on what what the inscription was on. No one repeated the 1898 inscription translation. We could not find a medieval focused epigrapher, a specialist in medieval engraving, because all we approached focused on classical ancient inscription rather than medieval. Understanding medieval epigraphy appeared to be a discipline without a huge database or scholarly focus. We hoped the paleographers would help us understand exactly what was written on the bells, but it was hard to procure an objective view, one not biased towards the existing record. However, we did finally employ a published specialist, an academic from a Spanish university, to check our research and understanding. There is a point I need to reinforce. It's the falsehood presented by paleographic students, scholars and experts we had consulted during the investigation process, and that anomalies that observers could not reason out were often attributed to a bell maker's error or omissions to save space on the inscription. The bell maker was an artisan, and the bell a costly item, a precious item, a devotional gift. And whereas artisans can make mistakes, they never pass them on to their employer. It is as true in the medieval period as it is today. Bespoke manufacture is expensive, and clients' expectations exacting. Any omission on an inscription would have made sense to the reader of the day. Historians citing potential mistakes and irrational omission, denigrating the medieval bell maker and the engraver's craft as flawed, should never be used to excuse the weakness of modern interpretation. All it does is expose the modern interpreter's own limitations. It is the modern interpretation that is far more likely to be flawed than the engraver's intent. With our interpretation of the bell inscription and the only plausible name found, we searched European medieval record for anyone potentially known as W. Le Riche in amongst the multiple titles each medieval noble would have held at the time. Further investigation would lead to a unique name in terms of Scottish medieval record, a knight called William le Riche. And interrogating the evidence available led to the only conclusion: William was a master of the Knights Templar in Scotland from around 1140 to around 1180, and by default, the bells and the site of Holywood were once Knights Templar possession. I hope to see you in part 2.